Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, a podcast for readers who want something strange and exciting, and writers who need something new. If you want to support this podcast, please consider buying my new book, The National Gallery. I'm extremely proud of this book because it may be my best book, and it is certainly my most personal and heartfelt book. But just because I say it's heartfelt doesn't mean it isn't full of weirdness, like sonnets about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and elegies for my dead iPhone. For a limited time, if you buy a copy of the National Gallery directly from me, I will sign it, and I will also send you a signed copy of my previous book, The Politics of Knives, for no additional cost. So you can order the book and get your free book with it at thenationalgallery.ca. That's thenationalgallery.ca. I'm also excited because it is my 10-year anniversary as an author. My first book, Ex Machina, was published in October 2009, and to celebrate, now that it is 2019, as I record this, I've made Ex Machina available as an ebook for the first time. It was never available as an ebook previously, and I'm giving that ebook away for free at jonathanball.com/freebook. So go to jonathanball.com/freebook, and you can sign up, get all my exciting news when it's exciting and new, and other free resources that I'll just send you as I create them, plus a free book. And again, you can go to thenationalgallery.ca if you want to find out more about my new book and get a free book as well when you order that. So two free books and a paid book available to you. In any case, let's get into the show. This is a very special episode because it is my 52nd episode, which represents then a year's worth of weekly podcasts. So that, hasn't been the precise schedule, but, here's a year's worth of weekly podcasts delivered to you, dear listener. And I want to do something special for you. And so when I was in Toronto supporting my book, The National Gallery, I met up with some people and did some recordings, and I'm sure one of them with you today. This is an interview I did with Andrew Pyper, big best-selling, thriller novelist Andrew Pyper. You could walk in a Walmart and find his book, Of course, I prefer you to go, as I'm sure Angie would also, to go to like a fine bookstore like McNally Robinson here in Winnipeg, or, any local independent bookstore near you and find his book. But you can find him anywhere. You can sneak in with me to talk to Andrew Pyper. And adding to the celebratory tone, Andrew and I were hanging out more or less in a bar/restaurant, and unbeknownst to us, there was a band setting up. So you'll hear some music in the background, and then it'll kind of start to edge into the foreground. We were told that the band would start really kind of getting things going an hour later than they did. So it's kind of an amusing thing that's happening as we're trying to talk about like a really not pedestrian, but a very office-y topic, like writing outlines. And as we're kind of doing that, there's this band kind of starting to really rock. So the sound quality on this one, is a bit of interesting. I like to say, again, that this is a celebration. Everybody is celebrating me talking to Pyper, his, fine presence, and of course, 52 episodes, the anniversary of sorts of this show. So without further ado, let's dive in and meet Andrew Pyper. So I'm here with Andrew Pyper at the Drake Commissary with, some natural music in the background, which we won't name, and nobody figure out what it is. And Andrew Pyper is the author of numerous books. His most recent book is The Homecoming. How would you describe The Homecoming, Andrew? Because we were just talking about how to describe his work precisely. He usually gets called a thriller author, but how would you describe The Homecoming?
I think The Homecoming is at its heart a thriller, but it's one that quite deliberately, from my point of view, kind of does a couple different things, a couple of unexpected maybe things. in terms of its genre. So it opens as a fairly traditional, almost like Agatha Christie-esque setup of a family that gathers at an estate for the reading of the will upon the death of the family's patriarch, and they realize, or at least it's disclosed to them, that the estate that they're on is owned by the father and is going to be divided among them on the condition that they stay there for 30 days. And after that, it becomes, you sort of think, okay, I know this story. It's going to be sort of a murder mystery. People start dying. Who's doing the killing? They can't get away. And in a sense, it is that. But then it becomes something else. Elements of science fiction are introduced. What may or may not be supernatural horror, even to a degree. And the world opens up at the end to reveal even a kind of dystopian, near future, apocalyptic setting or background to the whole story. So it sounds, now that I'm saying it, it sounds kind of like just a goulash, but hopefully it's a little bit more elegantly laid out than that. But it's a hybrid of about 3 or 4 genres.
Yeah, I thought the dystopia elements were really interesting, the SF dystopia elements in particular, because, as you say, they do kind of really open up at the end, and it's very backgrounded throughout the book. So it was a book that I almost felt like seemed like it could open up into another book or what have you. Not that it has to or anything, but I feel like it was very restrained, how you were handling those elements, and they added a lot of interesting atmosphere and color to it. I thought.
Oh yeah.
Because as you say, you kind of keep it focused on the situation that they're in, the kind of in this compound. It starts to seem very supernatural. It has a very barreling opening in particular. Once those disturbing figures start to appear, outside and so on. So there's a couple of things I wanted to kind of talk to you about. But one thing that we're hoping to talk about is a writing specific element of the writing process, which I've converted to, and I don't know you do, which is outlining.
Yes.
And one thing I want to just maybe start with was when there's an old genre that people don't write anymore, but it was very popular, a couple hundred years ago, called conversion narratives. So it was, the story. People write these memoirs of how they came to be, Christians or whatever. After having toiled in the darkness, they would then become, Anglican, and they would write a narrative about how that had happened and they had become converted. I always think of this old genre when I think about outlining, is because I'm very much have my conversion narrative, where I became a convert to writing outlines. So I'm just wondering, for you, when you started, writing novels, were you always kind of using outlines or working with that process, or did you kind of convert to it at some point? When did you start with the outlining?
Oh, I think I just intuited that if I was going to write a novel, I would need to think about it in advance. That I guess I was daunted enough that I thought, okay, I have no idea how to do this. So you should probably get prepared. You should, it's like sort of going in for a hike in the woods. Don't bring water and snacks, and so I just started. Again, I guess through a kind of out of respect for the size of the project, I kind of thought about, okay, what's going to happen when, and what needs to happen, sort of those sort of big questions. And thanks. Thank you. So I started outlining from the very beginning, and I remember, more or less, that what I did then for my first novel, Lost Girls. So this is, I would have been doing this on an apartment wall in Peterborough in 1996. but I sort of stapled together 8.5 by 11 blank pieces of paper, and when I had sort of collected my thoughts and my notes, that I sort of thought, I think I know what happens in this novel. I kind of went through 2 or 3 versions of this timeline that I kind of went from floor to ceiling in this apartment. And once I'd decided, okay, here's the sort of the 4 or 5 main turns of the story, I filled in each chapter, and then within each chapter, each scene, and sort of wrote down on these pieces of paper along this line what happens in each scene, even bits of dialogue, directions, reveals, what needs to be revealed in this scene so that we can get to the next scene. And it was quite detailed. It was it wasn't a synopsis. It wasn't in written form. It was very graphic, but I found that enormously helpful. And I do versions, and have done versions of that ever since in every book.
Do you still do it fairly graphically like that, or do you do more of a written document, or both?
It has changed over time, but mostly yes. It ends up being a thing on the wall, and I find it helpful for a few reasons. One is that I find that thing on the wall provides a certain psychological aid. It's almost like a companion. It's almost like it helps prevent that feeling that I think we all have when we sort of are trying to write a book at some point or another where you feel lost. You just feel like, I have no idea where the hell I am. I don't know what's going on. Where am I in this book? And so the outline, when it's there on the wall, you can look at it and go well, there I am. For better or for worse, here I am along the pathway through the forest. So that there's company, and it allows me to kind of, if I really believe in the outline, and I don't start until I do, then I can sort of jump around, so that if I'm at a point in the story, even in a scene where I'm like, this sucks, I don't like being here, this isn't working, instead of just well, damn it, I'm going to hammer this out until it works, and maybe I'll go back and fix it later, I can jump forward to this is going to be fun to write, so I'll just go right to the part where this person gets dismembered, in the shower, and then go back to that problematic scene when maybe I have a solution to it or something that can kind of kick it into shape, which is, I think, really much harder to do if you're just pantsing it, if you're just kind of diving in. I think having taught a few workshops on this topic, I think a lot of the time failed novels, where by failed novel I mean incomplete novels, are incomplete not because they're bad ideas, but because the writer got tired of their own story at some midpoint because they hadn't sort of thought through the whole story. Then you get frustrated, and you sort of feel like the thing's failed, and then it just ends up in the bottom of your closet. And I think an outline could have at least seen half of those projects to their end. Whether they're good or not is a separate question. But so I think the outline, as you can tell, I get quite enthusiastic about it. But I think it helps. It helps in a number of ways, but mostly it helps you get to the end.
I do most of mine on cue cards because I come from a screenwriting background where cue cards are really ubiquitous, and I think that's one of the most valuable things that I've found is that non-linear approach. You can now you don't have to be stuck in your Word document. I changed my software program to a program called Scrivener that specifically so I can more easily work non-linearly, and just that being able to jump ahead or around when you're stuck is so valuable.
Yeah.
Because so often you'll get the idea for something you're not working on right now, and you can just put the idea in your notebook, but you could also just start writing that scene and move around in that kind of free-floating way. But it's very easy to get lost, right?
For sure.
I've found, at least, unless you have some master plan, even if you change the plan, as long as you have some sort of vague or as detailed as possible notion of how that whole thing might work. One question I kind of have around it though is so before you had started doing mapping out your first novel in this way, had you done a lot of like, what was your, I guess, your background as a writer at that point? Because I know that you were initially doing a law degree. Like you got your law degree, correct? Were you called to the bar? And, yeah. And so then you switched into this novel career. So I'm curious, just personally, like I know a number of writers who've done that.
Yes.
Like went all the way through law school, and so on. But then we're just done with that and became writers instead. So I'm just curious about that. Like, why did you do that? And then two, what was sort of then also your preparation before you started doing this outline and working on that first book?
Well, to the first question, about law school, I studied English for an undergrad and enjoyed it, and so stuck around, did a master's degree in English. This is all at McGill University, and I was at that point where I sort of, there's the crossroads. It was kind of was always there, but then it became right in my face, which is, are you going to pursue the PhD? Are you going to sort of become pursue academic work, or something else? It's time to get out. You can't just sort of compile MAs. Well, maybe you could, but I didn't want to. So, and then I recognized that I probably could do this work, on the academic side. But I looked around and I realized, wow, there's a lot of people who are way better at this than I am. It was one of those recognitions of like, this isn't. You could fake it maybe to some degree, but there's people who are far more. Just their skill sets are stronger at academic work than yours. So I went to law school for that same, I think, sort of set of reasons that a lot of people end up there, which is like, what do you do with kind of generally, sort of above average verbal and reading skills, but you sort of need a job. But I recognized quite early on at law school that I had a similar sort of feeling as I did when I stared down a PhD, which is, I don't think I want to do this. I could do this, but there would be some degree of mimicry or something deeply disingenuous if I did. But I had been writing, to answer now to the second question. I've been writing all along. So whether through high school and as an undergraduate, I was writing short stories and sending them out to journals, and some of them were being published in magazines and journals. And but they're all exclusively short stories. So my first book was in fact a collection of short stories. It was published with a small press, Porcupine's Quill, and I kind of, the reward that I gave myself for completing the bar admission course was not, a lot of my colleagues were like taking a year off and, backpacking through Europe, and I moved to Peterborough and wrote a novel because that's what I really, really wanted to do. And so I guess I sort of had that, which brings us to that, so the law is behind me. I was pretty resolved that I wasn't going to do it even if money forced me to do it. I would rather I was a bartender, so I was like, maybe I'll just be a career bartender who writes short stories on the side. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time someone did that. But then I was like, okay, I had some savings from my year articling on Bay Street at a big firm, so I had some cash and wrote a novel. But again, I think I had a sense of like, you can't waste your time here like this because the clock's going to run out. So it wasn't a really kind of loosey-goosey, let's just see how this goes, which, so I was like, okay, an outline. You should really, what is this, however kind of crazy this idea is, never mind that, but just map out the story so you can be more efficient. So I had right from the beginning, I guess, I had a really strong, pragmatic approach to the process.
Yeah, I advise people often when they resist this outlining process that I tell them that they should learn to do it. Even if they don't want to do it, and if they don't do it, because there's, on the pragmatic side, like, it is a skill that you can sell to people. Like, you can, get hired to write a treatment for a film or what have you. And you can use that, and you can, on the other side of it, you can write that outline. You'll have to at some point write a synopsis. You want to be pitching this book to a publisher anyway. You have to at some point, very good. You have to at some point, maybe you want to write a grant proposal, you need to have that proposal and so on. I find it like even if you don't want to use it, it helps you clarify the idea.
Yes.
And as you say, there's an efficiency to that, but there's also the level of like, do I even want to do this idea?
Yes. Yeah.
Have you had that happen to you like much, where you've like been pursuing the idea, and then at a certain point in the outlining, you're like, you know what? I don't want to write this book.
Yes. Yes. At least twice, if not more. I've got quite deep into the outlining of a book, and yes, felt like no, I see it. I've made it work. It's not that the outline sort of has crumbled. There's a novel that works. I don't want to write it because it didn't pass that test. And I think that's one of the real benefits of outlining, is that we can all sort of, the assumption when we talk about I've got an idea for a story is that it's just because it comes from you that it's good, even within your own sense of judgment. So just having an idea isn't a sufficient reason to then spend the next year writing a book. And an outline, just sort of thinking, okay, what, then this, what about this? Why does she do that? Are really all different versions of one more central question which is, why am I the one to write this? Why am I even doing this? And that should be obvious. And I think, I say this sometimes, again, in sort of a workshop setting, and people are kind of like, they think I'm joking. They sort of laugh like, oh, that goes without saying. But it really doesn't. Like, why are you the one to write this story? And that's not to say that there has to be some personal element. It's not some kind of biographical element. But just, do you have the passion for it? Do you get excited when you see the thing when you see the thing outlined? Are you like, oh man, if I don't feel like I really want to tell this story because I want to take people on this ride, because I've designed a really cool ride I want to take you on, then it's not going to work. So again, it has that, an outline provides that test, and it also is sort of like, I'll say one sort of more kind of this sort of a particular thing about an outline, and this has taken me somewhat longer to kind of realize, is we sort of think about beginnings and ends a lot. Like, so where does it start? Okay, what's your way in, and how does it end? And those are important, but I've come to see that the most important turn in the story is actually in the middle. Like, what's the midpoint? Which in a kind of conventional sort of screenwriting sense is kind of like, the low point typically for the protagonist. It's where she's farthest from the thing that she wants or is seeking. Or it can sometimes be, like in the case of The Homecoming, it can be the point where the terms of the story get really flipped on their side, so a big reveal. Or it can be where the protagonist realizes, oh, wait a minute, I'm wrong. Like I was wrong to sort of, it's like I often cite E.T., Spielberg's movie, which is kind of perfectly constructed, but in E.T., the midpoint is Elliot is sort of thinking like, I need to keep my friend, the alien E.T., he's going to be my friend, I need to protect my friend, I need to keep him a secret. And at the midpoint, he realizes, no, if I'm going to be a really good friend to E.T., I need to help him go home. So the story changes. What the story is about, in that case, alters in a really dramatic way at the midpoint. And so, for me, one of the additional things that an outline does is helps you discover in advance what I think of as the aboutness of a story, which is different from what the story is about. What the story is about is some kind of, sequential synopsis, kind of like this happens, and then. But the aboutness is often, or ought to be, a more unexpected or deeper or psychologically kind of rich, surprising aspect to the story that I think you can only arrive at through doing a really kind of thorough, surface about, the surface of the story, the story structure. So again, it's not just sort of, I think people hear like the term outline and they sort of like, oh yeah, that's engineering, right? It's architecture. And in fact, it all leads back to sort of a more deeply reveal of character.
Well, for me, it's even it is architecture, and I really appreciate that. I started getting really interested in fiction and writing novels specifically for me when I was young, and I was reading Stephen King and Salman Rushdie. And when I started reading Salman Rushdie in particular, I had read the Satanic Verses, and because I had heard you weren't supposed to read the Satanic Verses, so that hooked me, right? But it has like this bizarre architecture, and I started with the completely separate, non-interconnecting narratives that just sort of this one character floats through, and it was very unusual. Having had read Stephen King, where you're just barreling forward, in this very clean and tight plot. Although King would poo-poo outlining. And having read this more complicated, strange architecture of a story, I got really interested in that. Like the narrative voice and the architecture of like what is a book. And what I always think about is I always think like so much of the work of writing is to figuring out like what is the thing, what is it, and then trying to like figure out like at its heart what is it and how do you make it more like what it is. It sounds esoteric to say it that way, but it sounds mystical, but I think that the tools to get it to that point are these very workman-like tools, and I feel like I wish there was a better, cooler word for outlining. Because it really is about like just figuring out like what is the core of this. I like the aboutness of it, because I feel like it's almost like you're getting to like you're trying to define the aboutness of the project, and then you're just trying to like isolate the major bones in that skeleton, and which things have to be here so it can stand and move and so on. It's a great way to put it, like the aboutness, because I feel so much of when I go and do editing, I find is I'm going back to that outline. I'm just stripping everything back to make it more like what it is, and less like what I maybe thought it was, or even maybe things I planned, but now in retrospect I can see just aren't working out. And then just on a practical level, in terms of efficiency, like I say, it just is nice to have a bit of a checklist, like because I like I sometimes say it's impossible to write a book, but you can sit down, you can write a scene, you can write a page, you can write a chapter, but you can't just sit down and write a book. Like I think Tony Burgess has done it, but like almost nobody like sits down and writes a book start to finish. It's like you really have to break it apart, and you can't have passion like the whole 700 hours you're working on this book. Like some days you just won't feel passionate about it. But if you want to have a career and have and do good work, you have to just keep working. And I feel like part of the outline's job is also just to keep you going and keep you on track when you maybe aren't in the mood.
For sure.
And then after it's already determined that, as you say, you've used it as a tool to figure out, yes, I am passionate about this, and then you can kind of go back to it and remember that you're passionate. Like on those days that you don't feel passion, you can remember like why you are the one to write the story. On those days that you just don't feel like the one to write the story anymore, it feels like it's gone. But you can go back to that document or whatever it is, those cue cards and that map, and you can figure out. You can just remember sort of who you were when you were doing better with this book. Or you can another kind of carrot on the end of the stick could be a really, really cool reveal, right? And not just a reveal, like it's I mean something more granular than that. So let's say here's sort of the bad pitch of it, but a moment where we realize, oh no, the killer isn't the guy in the black cloak, it's the cop, right? So that's the reveal, and you could maybe if you're just sort of concentrating on the about of the story, you're just like, okay, I'm just going to write my way to that moment. I don't really know how the reveal works, or exactly when it happens, but I just know that we're going to go from the thinking that it's this guy to it's the cop. But if you in an outline, you sort of think about in advance. Well, how does that outline work? What's the best way when should that reveal happen, and how should it happen in relation to the protagonist? Let's say, so if the cop is someone who, is a homophobe,
who's a sort of, and that's his character, and he's sort of like, we don't like this guy, but hey, he's sort of, I guess, on the side of trying to catch the killer. You might think, I know, I'll have the scene happen where we discover him at like at a gay bar or at a leather bar, and that's sort of like that. This pitch is going south fast, but
the principle, I see what you're saying.
Right.
You're thinking through what's the best option, because unless you try options without having to write the whole scene.
Right. That's right. And then if you have something like, this is going to be delicious, this is going to totally work, I really want to work toward this moment. On those bad days, you can say, well, come on, like you want to reward yourself with this great reveal, right? Like if you can get a reader to that moment, they're going to really, this is all going to be worthwhile. As opposed to, again, that kind of like, well, here we go. And I guess if I just kind of write 100,000 or 90,000 words, we'll call it a book. It can feel pretty hopeless pretty fast.
It's this is a bit of a side note, but what do you do on the bad days? Like, what's your ritual on the bad days when you get up and you're just
not feeling it? Yeah,
whatever reason.
Typically, I would read a book that I already admire. And so read and just open it in the middle. So just choose a writer that you love and just read a couple of their pages. And that for me, sort of like that sort of aspirational impulse to like, I want that. I want to write something as good as that. Brings me back to you sort of think wouldn't that be discouraging on a bad day?
Well, I found it so discouraging. I took all the books out of my office because I was doing that.
Okay.
I put them in the basement. But
okay, that might be bad advice.
Other days it works. So that's what you find. You just got to remind yourself of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and sort of being in the hand, sort of enjoying someone else's sentences gets me sort of like, ooh, I want to do that. And if that fails, I think changing your physical situation. So go outside, go for a walk. Don't think about the project. Just do something else. And another one, this is maybe sort of peculiar to me, but I find a long hot shower often will provide, if the problem that you're having is like, how do I get in and out of this scene? Or if it's mechanical in some way, showers for me, I kind of go in and I'm like, oh yeah, he arrives by these means, he learns this and that, and then the really kind of like, the plumbing work can be done in a shower.
I was when you were talking about midpoints. David Annandale is the writer who told me about midpoints, and he mentioned how The Shining has this midpoint where halfway through the book, the girl in the bathtub, I think it was, reaches for him and grabs him. So I might be misremembering that, but there's a moment in any case where it becomes clear that these things are real and can touch me, and all the stakes are now clear, and I've since started to really like you. I've really come around to this idea of like midpoints and noticing like there's this middle position in so many different genres. Sometimes it's just intrinsic to the genre. Like in a horror story, almost always halfway through they realize the monster is true and real.
Yep.
Whereas before that they've been just ignoring that it's real or denying it in some way. In certain like thrillers, they'll like if it's a wrongfully accused person, halfway through they'll figure out who's actually is the person who committed the crime, and then they go from being chased to chasing somebody. I see that midpoint structure so much, and I find like that's such a useful. Those, whether it's a midpoint or something else, like those structural moments, as you say in the middle, are so they're so important, and they do get short shrift relative to like an opening and a closing, or even in a scene, like the beginning and ending of a scene, are important, but that middle structuring is often just so valuable to just have an idea of in advance. And I used to resist outlining, but then I caught myself where I realized that what I was doing was I was sitting down to just pants it, but I was actually just sitting down thinking a little bit about, well, what should I write? I was like mapping the scene out in my head, and I would get up and like sometimes like stand in different positions in the room and just kind of try to figure out what the person would do next. And what I realized was, I'm just outlining, but in a really lousy and idiotic manner. Why don't I do a real outline? And then since I tried that, it just was revelatory. When you're actually putting together this document now, how is it different? Like, what does it actually look like? So for the homecoming, for example, like what would that outline look like? Is it 10 single space pages? Like what is it?
Well, in the case, I'll give you so the homecoming, the outline for that book was, very much like the previous ones in the sense that it would be, I sort of staple these pieces of paper together so they're a long tail. And I get a ruler or the side of a book and I write a line right down, not the middle, but sort of like a third of the way in from the left margin or side. And then I would put in like the 3 or 4 big points first. So the beginning, what's our opening, what's our way in, what do we see in the first page? End of the inciting incident. What's the thing that changes normalcy? The disruption of normalcy. So someone comes into town, or we find the dead body, or something that alters our regularity. End of Act 1. Which is, I sort of think of as like the point of no return. So we sort of feel like, from the protagonist's point of view, prior to the end of Act 1, she could be like, you know what, I'm out of this novel. I don't want to proceed with this story. But after the end of Act 1, she's all in, for better or for worse. Then the midpoint, as we've discussed. Then end of Act 2, which is okay, we're pretty much entirely now equipped with the terms of the story. There's not going to be any sort of changes of the rules, but now, so that the remaining big question is, how is it going to end? Are they going to succeed? Who's going to survive? Whatever the case may be. And then Act 3 is kind of a propulsive series of revelations and actions that take us to the conclusion. So I kind of put those 4 or 5 points on the map, on the line, and then it's filling in. So all the different scenes, all the sort of like, I want to write a scene in this place, because the events that have to happen to make those 4 or 5 big turning points make sense. And so it ends up being a sort of a 6 foot long, and then I pin it to the wall, so it's a 6 foot high line. And then I'll have on that left side the different sort of numbers, so like sort of, the different scenes, so 1 to 140. The contents of the scene on the right, and then I'll even add a sort of a sign in very rough terms, word counts in advance. So I'll say, well, this scene, it's necessary, but don't make a meal out of it, Andrew, so this should be 500 words. This is a bigger moment, with the big showdown with the villain or whatever. So this should be like 3,000 words. Because I think sometimes we can sort of short shrift important moments, or inexplicably, we've all read sort of manuscripts or books that don't work, where you're like, why are we here? Why are we just spending so much time in this place? And I think it's because, or at least in part, the writer hasn't sort of prioritized or created a hierarchy of scenes. This is a more important scene. We should spend more time in it. So that aids in pacing. So that you're not, again, sort of, you don't, or it also prevents maybe like, I think this is a good book. Right now it's 240,000 words. I'm going to have to, rip a good book out of it, maybe. But when you ascribe word counts in advance, it largely prevents that particular problem. So, having said all that, it changes too. So sometimes that outline on particular books, for whatever reason, it just requires those 4 points, or the 4 or 5 big turn points, and I just kind of like more or less jump in at an earlier point. The book that I'm working on outlining now, for whatever reason, started as like a synopsis, like a written synopsis, and I've been kind of revising it, like it's a 5-page, basically just kind of a pitch, but in written form, which is unusual for me, and for whatever reason, it seems that it wants to be done that way. So sometimes the story, the kind of story that you're writing, will ask for a particular kind of outline. But for me, no matter what kind of variations will be applied to the particular outline, it always in my mind is a line. That's not to say that the storytelling is linear per se, or that it's sequential. I can mess with the time a lot within that line, but it's still a kind of a marathon. And here's the map.
So, how long would it take you to do that if you're doing a fuller thing like that? Like, how much time do you spend on that? How much time do you spend like outlining and planning in that way, generally speaking?
I spend more proportionally on that part as I proceed from book to book.
Yeah.
So what I call the pre-writing. So this just sort of thinking about it, researching either directly, like, hey, what's Washington State look like in November, to the more kind of loosey-goosey, hey, this kind of feels like this movie. Maybe I should rewatch that movie to see if I can sort of, is there a mood or a gesture I can borrow from it. Compiling ideas, character tics, just a really kind of random, it looks like, and my wife will sort of attest that it looks like I'm doing nothing, but the doing nothing is, I spend more time on that, and because I feel like when then it ends, that process ends with the outline, and then I begin writing, and when the outline is that solid, I find that from there to first draft has shrunk over the years for me. Not because I don't think it's because I'm careless. It's that then I'm really, really excited. I'm raring to go, and it's like, have a dog on the leash and you take it off and it's running. I'm really, really excited. I know where I'm going. I can get more words written in a day because I'm sure of what I'm doing. So the first draft takes a lot less. So to answer your question, maybe sort of if the pre-writing is like 3 or 4 or 5 months, and then first draft can be done in 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, I find people resist sometimes doing the outlining or pre-writing process like that because they just, for whatever reason, but one reason sometimes is they tell me, well, it's a lot of extra work. I find it's less work. You work so much faster.
Yeah.
And it's, for me, I don't know, everyone's different. I've gotten to the point where I feel like unless you're doing some pre-writing process that has some level of rigor, I don't see how somebody could be a professional writer. Like, I don't see how it could be physically possible. Like, I know people do it, but like, I don't know how it happens because just the ability to even just figure out how long this thing is going to take me, if it's going well or bad or whatever, as you say, like getting immersed in it and getting excited about it. I find like it's a more fun experience with the outline pre-writing process, and I also find like it just is more efficient as well. You save yourself so much time in editing. I do less drafts are required because even if my first draft took me as long, like I would do less drafts. At least for me anyway.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And the other thing that I think is interesting and useful about it is I think you already mentioned this, but like you can just like get bored of it you figure out real fast, like I don't care about these people.
Yeah.
I just don't care enough, or there's just everything's there, but why I should be there, as you were saying before, like, my take on it is too much like this thing. It's too, I can't get that twist or whatever is me in there. It's just so much easier to find that thing out in like a pre-writing process than you're on page 300.
Yeah.
You've written 80,000 words.
And you hate it.
And you don't know how to fix it, or it's fine, but you don't know if you want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Which, as you say, like I think a lot of quote-unquote failed books kind of maybe result from people just losing steam in that fashion. Whereas like if you've got the outline, you've got the plan, you could lose steam and still like know where you are. Like one of the nice things about what you're describing, that check, is that your sort of timeline of the book or whatever you want to, your outline on the wall kind of thing. Is you can also like look at that and like see like where you're at, what
totally.
you've done, and so there's like progress that's visible or clear. Whereas so much of the time when you're just working on a book, I find you just don't know where you are, you know, if you don't have a plan. Even if you don't stick to that plan, like at least you know you're making progress. Whereas, you know, if you write 500 words that day, you know you've accomplished something as opposed to just there's 500 more words.
Yeah.
In your life.
And there can be those rewards of progress, as you say, and also rewards of the beats in the story that are going to be really, really fun. You know, whether it's like, you know, in this beat we realize something unexpected. Yeah. So when you have that mapped out, it's just fun to kind of get to a point where, like, I know if I get through the next 1,000 words, I'm going to have this, you know, this message written in the mirror in lipstick that's going to not only move the story forward, but it's going to, you know, it's going to be startling to the reader as well as to yourself in a way, right? Whereas I think if you're just sort of like, I'm making this up as I go along, those moments are kind of, I'm not sure how you arrive at them, but there is a real, I think there, you know, the aversion to outline, I think, comes from a place of, you know, there's a romanticism to, if I just sit down, this thing's going to be magical and happen. It's I think people have said this to me, that the outline, they see the outline as sort of anti-magic, or it sort of, you're trying to turn it into a... Yeah, sure. I will.
One more.
When in fact, I think, you know, the outline, for all of its other sort of practical uses we've just, you know, discussed, it's really fun. Like I find it as fun, if not more fun, than the sentence making.
I look at like a sonnet. Like, you wouldn't tell a poet, like, "Oh, you're writing a sonnet? You must be an idiot." There's no creativity there. It's right. Like, no, like all art comes from the constraint on, you know, a system, and then you are creative inside that system. And so the outline is sort of like you're inventing a form, basically, for the thing. Like, maybe you're borrowing from, you know, the horror novel or whatever it is, but, you know, you're now like thinking through like how you're going to do it differently, and mapping, as you say, like the major. You're making sure it will work. You're not going to waste your time for the next year working on this thing. And you know. And you also don't have to like slavishly follow the outline.
No.
Like what I often find is that if my thing is going exactly according to plan, I know something's wrong. Like I have to like deviate from the plan, not to a certain degree, or it's just I'm not thinking hard enough. I wasn't, you know, because once you're on the ground, it's, you know, the world's different. But there's things you can't anticipate. You know, character does something, but you know, but I think it is a false. I agree with you. Like, it's a very false dichotomy to think that, oh, you know, some sort of planning means you can't be spontaneous.
Oh no, you're completely right. Yeah, and it's not. You can. There's all sorts of deviation. I'll give you an example. In the Demonologist, in the outline, which was otherwise pretty much completely adhered to, there was a character called O'Brien, who was initially conceived of as an older man, professor colleague of the main character, who our main character would sort of check in with periodically as he's on the road. And this older man, he was not part of the story. He was back in New York. He was just a voice on the phone, a sounding board. And then when I started writing the book, O'Brien just abruptly became a woman of the same age as our character, our protagonist, who ends up joining him on his journey at the midpoint. And I even tried to, you know, to like, okay, that's fun, haha, you've played a trick on me, you've pushed your way into the book. I tried to sort of kill her off. It's like, okay, fun's over, you're dead now, you're gone. And she wouldn't, you know, she came back. And so sometimes it can be that, you know, that sort of fun, characters they don't always do what they're told. And I think that, you know, in that case, the book benefited from that character showing up when she showed up, having a larger role to play. So no, it's not like oh, I've made an outline now. I'm handcuffed. it's as I say, like for me, that kind of what ifing, and then I sort of like verbally pitch it. I think this is something where, again, in workshops I do, and it's amazing how people will be like, oh, I'm kind of stuck on this idea. And say, well, just tell me about it. Like, just in 30 seconds, tell me the idea. And they're like, well, it's about blah, 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 blah. And you see them get stuck in the verbal thing. It's like, I don't have to say, hey, there's a problem, or you need to do this. They hear it. And they'll come to this like, oh, I should actually, it should really be told from the milkman's point of view. Oh my God. And they've been stuck on this for a year, and over the course of maybe 5 minutes just verbalizing it, they see the problem and the solution. So outlines do exactly that. It's basically self-pitching. And I don't know why as writers we sort of like, no, we never do that. We never share the idea. We don't talk to ourselves out loud about the idea. We sort of assume like, no, I carry it around in my head. And it's like, I don't, and I do this myself, by the way, but it's 90% of, I think, the story's problems are a result of presuming that this is a private process or an internal process or a silent process, when in fact, again, sort of like verbalizing, outlining, they're all gestures toward externalizing and manifesting the story in some way. Then you can look at it or hear it and go, oh, the problem's obvious, and so is the solution. But no, we insist on, removing ourselves into the sort of the private space, not sharing the idea, sitting on it, and then we just kind of suffer alone.
I feel like it's a part of an investment that the industry has, or at least people in the culture have, in this romantic idea of being a genius rather than just being a guy who digs ditches, and is doing an intellectual work. We're getting played off, so I'm going to have to let it go. But I appreciate you talking to me about one of my bugbears, and everyone go read The Homecoming. And I also love The Killing Circle in particular, although all Vanish's books are fine, books you should pick up.
Thanks, Jonathan.